18th February, 1943. Amiens, northern France. Dawn breaks gray and cold over a stretch of flat farmland, and 18 aircraft skim so low over the frozen fields that their propeller wash flattens the frost beneath them. Inside Amiens Prison, over 700 people wait, many of them members of the French resistance, condemned to execution within hours. There is no time for a conventional bombing raid, no time for altitude, for formation, for margin of error. What is needed is precision measured not in kilometers, but in meters, delivered by aircraft fast enough to outrun the fighters sent to stop them, and light enough to have been built, in part, by furniture makers. This is the story of the airplane that made that raid possible, and in doing so, quietly rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. By the winter of 1943, Britain's air war had a problem that no amount of courage could solve. Heavy bombers like the Lancaster and the Halifax could carry devastating loads, but they were slow, cumbersome, and dependent on fighter escort or the cover of darkness to survive. Precision was not their strength. Area bombing was, yet the war demanded targets struck with surgical accuracy. A prison wall, a single factory shed, a Gestapo headquarters buried in a residential street. Meanwhile, aluminium, the backbone material of nearly every combat aircraft on either side, was in desperately short supply. Britain's factories were already stretched thin producing fighters and heavy bombers, and metal stocks were rationed with the same anxiety as food. Any new aircraft that competed for aluminium risked starving existing production lines that Fighter Command and Bomber Command depended upon. The Air Ministry, when first approached with a proposal for a fast, unarmed bomber built almost entirely from wood, was skeptical, bordering on dismissive, and early proposals sat largely ignored on desks in Whitehall for the better part of a year before official interest finally caught up with the design. An aircraft with no defensive guns sounded to many officials like a death sentence for its crew. The challenge was not simply building a faster aeroplane, it was proving that speed itself, unaided by armor or armament, could be a viable form of protection, an idea that ran against nearly everything conventional air doctrine assumed. Existing light bombers, such as the Bristol Blenheim, had tried to fill this gap and failed badly. By 1940, the Blenheim's losses over occupied Europe had become so severe that entire squadrons were being decimated within weeks. It was simply too slow to escape modern fighters and too lightly built to absorb the damage a heavier bomber might survive. Something had to change, and it had to change quickly, without drawing further on the aluminium reserves the rest of the war effort so badly needed. Estimates from wartime planners suggested that every ton of aluminium diverted to a new bomber program meant fewer Spitfires or Hurricanes reaching Fighter Command at the exact moment Britain could least afford the shortfall. The answer came from de Havilland, working out of Salisbury Hall near London Colney and later the main factory at Hatfield. Geoffrey de Havilland and his design team proposed something radical. An aircraft built not from scarce aircraft-grade aluminium, but from plywood and balsa wood, sandwiched together in a molded shell and bonded with casein glue, then reinforced with spruce stringers. The fuselage was built in two vertical halves, cured under heat lamps, then joined together like a wooden eggshell, a technique closer to boat building than conventional aviation. Because the material was wood rather than metal, the workforce did not need to be drawn from the already overstretched pool of aircraft engineers. Furniture manufacturers, piano makers, and cabinet workshops across Britain, firms with no prior aviation experience whatsoever, were brought into the supply chain, turning out fuselage shells in workshops that had, a year earlier, been building wardrobes and dining tables. The finished aircraft, christened the Mosquito, weighed roughly half that of a comparable metal bomber, yet was powered by two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same engines used in the Spitfire, giving it a top speed of around 610 kilometers per hour. Faster than most fighters flying at the time, including the Luftwaffe's own Messerschmitt Bf 109 at lower altitudes. Picture a family saloon car suddenly finding itself with the engine of two racing motorcycles bolted to its bonnet, That is roughly the imbalance of power to weight the Mosquito enjoyed over its contemporaries. The engines themselves, each capable of producing well over 1,000 horsepower, sat in nacelles slung beneath a wing spanning just under 17 meters, a wingspan not much greater than that of a modern regional airliner, yet carrying a bomber's payload at a fighter's speed. Assembly spread far beyond Hatfield itself, with dispersed production sites established specifically to reduce the risk that a single bombing raid could cripple the entire program, a lesson learned bitterly from earlier losses elsewhere in British industry. Exact wartime production figures were treated as classified information at the time, and even now historians rely on post-war Air Ministry records rather than contemporary announcements to reconstruct the full output. Its designers had gambled that a bomber too fast to catch needed no guns at all. They were right. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Mosquito's operational record bore out that gamble again and again. At Amiens on that February morning, a formation of Mosquitoes dropped their bombs with such accuracy that they breached the prison walls in multiple places, allowing over 250 prisoners to escape before German guards could organize a response. Though the operation also killed a number of prisoners in the blast, a sobering reminder that precision bombing, even at its best, was never without cost. In Copenhagen in March 1945, Mosquitoes of 140 wing flew at rooftop height through the city streets to strike the Gestapo headquarters at Shellhuis, an operation still remembered in Danish resistance history, though one raid tragically also struck a nearby school. Over Oslo, Norway, low-level Mosquito attacks targeted Gestapo offices with similar precision, striking fear into occupying administrators who had, until then, assumed their inland offices were beyond the reach of British bombers entirely. German fighter pilots reported extraordinary difficulty intercepting the aircraft at all, and where interception did occur, Mosquitoes frequently simply accelerated away. Some crews later described the sound of a mosquito passing overhead as closer to a sharp crack than the drone typical of heavier bombers, gone almost as soon as it was heard. Exact loss figures across the war remain contested by historians, but the type consistently posted among the lowest loss rates of any RAF bomber operating over occupied Europe, a statistic that speaks for itself. Records from many individual raids remain incomplete, or were never fully declassified, and where crews did not return, their exact fate over hostile territory is sometimes still unknown today. Germany never produced an equivalent. The Luftwaffe's Junkers Ju-88 was versatile and respected, but built from metal, heavier, and slower by a significant margin. Later in the war, Germany attempted its own wooden aircraft, the Heinkel Hayes 162, but that project was born of desperation and aluminium shortage rather than deliberate design philosophy, and it arrived too late and too flawed to matter. The Americans, meanwhile, had nothing directly comparable. Their closest analog in spirit, the twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning, was a formidable fighter, but built entirely from metal and designed around air combat rather than unarmed precision bombing. What set the Mosquito apart was not merely its wood construction, but the philosophy behind it. An aircraft designed from the outset to outrun its enemies rather than outgun them, adaptable enough to serve as a bomber, a night fighter,
a photo reconnaissance platform, and a pathfinder for heavier raids, sometimes all within the same production run. Even the Soviet Union, which relied heavily on its own wooden fighter designs such as the Lavochkin Lay-5 out of similar material necessity, never combined that construction method with anything approaching the Mosquito's speed or versatility. It stood by 1944 in a category of its own. The Mosquito's legacy is difficult to overstate, though historians are careful not to overstate it either. Its material impact, bridges destroyed, headquarters struck, prisoners freed, is well documented. Its psychological impact on German commanders, who never quite solved the problem of intercepting an aircraft that simply refused to slow down, is harder to quantify but was noted repeatedly in wartime intelligence reports. Some 50% of the roughly 7,700 Mosquitoes built served in reconnaissance and bomber roles rather than as night fighters, a versatility that few other aircraft of the war could claim. Its influence lingered long after 1945, Feeding into post-war thinking about speed as a defensive strategy, an idea later echoed in Cold War reconnaissance aircraft designed to simply outrun interception altogether. Surviving Mosquitoes can still be seen today, including a rare airworthy example maintained in New Zealand and static aircraft on display at the Imperial War Museum, Duxford, and the RAF Museum in London, wooden airframes that have remarkably outlasted many of their metal contemporaries. Restoration teams working on these survivors have noted just how unusual the type remains even by today's standards. Its bonded wooden construction closer in principle to a modern composite aircraft than to anything else flying in the 1940s, a coincidence of engineering that historians have only fully appreciated with hindsight. Return for a moment to that February dawn over Amiens. 18 aircraft built from spruce and plywood in workshops that once made furniture, flown by crews who carried no defensive guns and no illusions about what would happen if they were caught. They were not protected by armor, they were protected by speed, by precision, and by a piece of engineering audacity that the Air Ministry had once dismissed outright. What began as a wooden aeroplane built to save aluminium became, within 2 years, one of the most versatile combat aircraft of the entire war.